Jana छंद भगत वृंद आरती तुम्हार, गायचे छंद भगत वृंद आरती तुम्हार, जय जय आरती तुम्हार, हर हर आरती तुम्हार, शिव शिव आरती तुम्हार। जय। ॐ ह्रीं ऋतं त्वमचलो गुणजिद्गुणेभ्यः नक्तं दिवं सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे यतोऽहं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारी गच्छन्त्यलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वं वक्रोद्धृतोऽपि हृदमे न च भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो तेजस्तरन्ति तरसा त्वयि तृष्णा रागे कृते हृतपथे त्वयि राम कृष्णे मर्त्यमृतं तव पदं मरणोन्विनाशम् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारी स्नान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं त्वशरणो जगदेकगम्य तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतार वरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। सर्वमङ्गल माङ्गल्ये शिवे सर्वार्थसाधिके शरण्ये त्र्यम्बके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टि स्थिति विनाशानां शक्ति भूते सनातनी गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी नमोस्तुते। शरणागत दीनार्त परित्राण परायणे सर्व शान्ति हरे देवी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय 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 महामाई की जय। जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय। जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
Namaste. Hello, check. Hello, check. Namaste Atirajaya Vivekananda Sure Satchit Sukaswarupaya Swami Vidyanathananda. So we had started this particular lecture of Vivekananda, Absolute and the Manifestation. And the question that had been posed right at the beginning of this particular lecture was, how does the Absolute become manifest? This is the philosophical problem that Advaita Vedanta faces. And from the more scientific perspective today, it's a reflection of basically a mirror symmetry, mirror image of this very same problem, as we had mentioned last time, what's called the hard problem of consciousness. Essentially, I think the point here is that there are two ways by which we experience the world. One is the first person perspective, which talks about each individual's very personal experiences. And then there is the sharing of that experience with others in terms of something which is common information. The second mode, sharing of common information, is what we call the third person perspective. And this very subjective experience that each individual has is called the first person perspective. What we are asking is, what is the bridge between, both this problem that has been framed in the language of Advaita Vedanta here and the hard problem of consciousness has been framed from a more scientific perspective. It addresses exactly this issue. It asks, what is the bridge between the first person perspective and the third person perspective? What is it that connects these two? Various forms of that are there. Essentially, how is it that there is something that is shared, objective, amongst these different first person perspectives, and that which is common is called the third person perspective? The answer to this cannot really be found in any philosophical text, and as of now, I don't think any real scientific method has gotten to the bottom of this particular problem. What then? Essentially, once we come to an impasse like this, we really have to ask more fundamental questions. And the fundamental question that needs to be addressed here is, what do we really mean by the first person perspective? Since we are discussing a lecture on Advaita Vedanta mostly, we really have to ask the question, what does this first person perspective mean? As opposed to, if we address the same problem from a scientific viewpoint, we would be asking, what exactly does the third person perspective mean? See, for instance, all dualistic philosophies, all dualistic ideas of devotion, etc., they assume, without really a rational basis, that there is this something or the other in front of me that we call the world. And that evokes a certain response, and then we try to grow and develop those responses along lines that we would like. But here, the question is framed from a first person perspective, essentially the universalization of the first person. That's what one is gunning for here. And that universal dimension to the first person perspective has various ideas, various terms for it. It's the principle of knowledge. And very often when you talk about the principle of knowledge in this very general form. In books, you will find it spelt with a capital K instead of a little k. That's what it really implies is that you're looking at a certain universal principle behind this subjective experience of knowledge. Similarly, existence. Each of us believes or assumes without any further rational justification that we exist. But what is existence in its most universal dimension? More precisely, what is it in us? What is it in my psyche? What is it in your psyche that basically says that such and such a thing does exist? What is existence about? These fundamental questions need to be addressed in order to even make sense of this question. And so the path that is indicated is not some kind of a philosophical resolution, but rather a process by which this enquiry is pursued to the fullest. This enquiry necessarily has to be through subjective analysis, through introspective analysis. It's not something that a bunch of logical conclusions will help us arrive at. So it is analytical, but it is an inward-looking analysis that needs to be performed. Why? Because the instrument through which we gain knowledge is really this individual mind. And what we are asking about, what we are trying to penetrate to, is the foundations of this mind. What are the foundational notions that define our mind? The principle of existence, the principle of knowledge are two such universal and fundamental notions. And so we are really asking, what does existence even mean? Apart from this common sense perception that this mic in front of me exists, this table in front of me exists, I exist, etc., etc. What is behind, what is a deeper understanding of this commonsensical fact? It's a fact of existence, and we would not be able to move around, walk around, if we did not assume that the world around us exists, if we did not assume that I exist as an individual, if we did not assume that this world around me and I are related as object to subject. This triad of the subject, the object, and the relationship between them, it could be one of knowledge, for instance. But this triad of a subject, object, and a relation between them is what defines our day-to-day existence. But what does existence even mean? Isn't existence something that is more fundamental than this subject-object relationship triad? And it is after we understand that this, when we are asking more fundamental questions like, what is existence in its most general dimension? What is the obtaining of knowledge? What is the principle of knowledge in its most universal dimension? What we are really asking for is the universal dimension to these individual experiences in the form of subject 1, experience 1, object 1, subject 2, experience 2, object 2, etc., etc. I have different subjective experiences. Some time back, I was walking outside this particular building. Now I am sitting inside it. I am also occasionally aware that there is this mic in front of me. These are these various subjective experiences that an individual has. So also for everybody. What is the unifying principle of all these experiences? The way the people who talk about the hard problem of consciousness, they formulate it this way. Suppose we were able to explain, in principle, our various phenomena in our body through, say, the phenomena of various nerve firings. So suppose a certain set of nerves fire, and then there is a symptom, and that subjective experience of that symptom is something we call pain. And suppose we were able to, suppose neuroscience is developed to a point where it has an explanation in terms of these nerve firings. Question: is this sequence of nerve firings itself pain? That's the question that one is asking. Why? Because in this word pain, there is this subjective factor which is indispensable, which is called subjective experience. How does this third person description in terms of various nerve firings which can be mapped, which can be used to cure diseases, which can be used for almost everything in this world, how can that somehow give rise, these third person descriptions, how do these things give rise to this first person experience called pain? Again, the explanatory gap is underscored. Third person information, third person knowledge translated to first person experience, first person knowledge, there is an explanatory gap there. If you want to view it differently, you have these various different first person experiences. And then there is this abstraction, something that is common to all of them, which is what we call a third person perspective. But how is it that this generalization occurs? This generalization is exactly what we call the principle of knowledge. We've discussed this before. Where does this universal dimension of human existence called the principle of knowledge lie? This is again the same question phrased somewhat differently. From the point of view of Advaita Vedanta, the question then becomes, how is it that this universal principle of knowledge becomes divided into these various fragmented pieces of knowledge that define our day-to-day experience? How does something that is unbounded, not caught within any framework, how does that become caught within the framework that our minds define? This then is a certain explanatory gap that is there at the foundation of what we call the human experience today. This is what we were discussing last time. After this, there's a little passage where he gives an aside about how Schopenhauer, famous philosopher, talked about something called the will, and how there's some will which is what is universal, etc., etc. And that's something that Vivekananda essentially disagrees with, because will is something that exists only in the framework of this relative world. So saying that there is some kind of a universal will is a misnomer. It's not appropriate, because it's only the conditioned thing that is there, seen in this earth, that we can call will. Okay, so this is a bit of an aside, and we will not get into it too much. But let's go on to the next point that he makes. And the next point that he makes is one about one framework that we all use in order to grasp things as pieces of knowledge. What is that? The principle of causality. And he takes this principle of causality in its most general form here. The stone falls, and we ask why. And when this curiosity comes, when this stone falls and we ask why, what is happening is essentially there is a seeking of a causal chain. The seeking of this causal chain, it assumes something fairly fundamental in our mental makeup. This is what he says now. This question, stone falls and we ask why. This question, why, is possible only on the supposition that nothing happens without a cause. I request you to make this very clear in your minds. For whenever we ask why anything happens, we are taking for granted that everything that happens must have a why. That is to say, it must have been preceded by something else which acted as the cause. This precedence and succession are what we call the law of causation. It means that everything in the universe is by turn a cause and an effect. It is the cause of certain things which come after it and is itself the effect of something else which has preceded it. This is called the law of causation and is a necessary condition of all our thinking. We believe that every particle in the universe, whatever it be, is in relation to every other particle. There has been much discussion as to how this idea arose. In Europe, there have been intuitive philosophers who believed that it was constitutional in humanity. Others have believed it came from experience. But the question has never been settled. I think this particular point is important to bear in mind. Where does this notion of causality come into being? Why? So essentially he has given 2 points, two views towards this. Where does causality come from? Where does this notion of causality come from? Each of us believes in this, that essentially, okay, I am sitting down now, maybe after some time I will get up, which means what? There is some exercising of the muscles, and then the physical posture is changed, and so there is some sequence of events leading to another event, and the sequence of events that precedes the succeeding event is exactly what is called the law of causality. This is how we grasp time. This is how we say that an event in a later time is related to an event in a preceding moment of time. The relationship between these events is what we call causality. But then, how come our minds grasp the world in terms of this causal framework? Where does this causation come from? Where does this notion of causation come from? And essentially 2 views. One, the more intuitive philosophers basically say that it is inherent in us. It is something that defines us. If we wanted to get away from it, then we would no longer be ourselves. This is the argument saying that it is constitutional in us. The other point of view is that it is born out of experience. That we see things happening and then we conclude that, yeah, this is the way things are. But as he says, this problem has not been settled. Why has it not been settled? It has not been settled basically because when we want to talk, there has to be some more fundamental reason for such a foundational problem not being settled. Why? And the reason is basically that there is a certain self-referentiality in this problem. When we say, when we even talk, when we think, when we discuss anything for that matter, what happens? There's a sequence of words that we speak, right? If I disordered the words and said a word that comes later on in the sentence in the beginning and the first part of the sentence last, then the sentence would become completely garbled, would lose meaning. The same thing for the written word. Sequence of words in a particular order convey a certain meaning. If you disordered the words, or you went further and disordered the letters, that meaning would no longer be conveyed. So, when we are asking for a more fundamental principle behind causation, we need to understand that it is not something that can be captured in conceptual terms by words, either spoken or written. Why? Because the spoken word or the written word occur within this framework of time and causation. We assume time is linear, is one-dimensional. There is something preceding another, some moment of time preceding another moment of time. And when we read from a sequence of words in a certain order, then there is a meaning conveyed. That order, that way of ordering words is necessarily done in the framework of time. So we are assuming time when we speak and claim to make sense. It's time that we assume when we read and the sentence makes sense. Why? This ordering of the words within time, either spoken or heard, that assumes this framework of time where one letter precedes another letter in time. And this connection of precedence followed by succession is exactly what we call the principle of causality. So when we are talking of some conceptual understanding of something as fundamental as this, something as fundamental as causation, then all that we can do is really either speak words or write words which follow the law of causation themselves. This is the self-referentiality. We cannot get outside this framework and claim to explain this framework from within itself, right? So it's this is a certain incompleteness in our logical faculties. There is a very deep theorem of logic called Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which essentially takes up this particular philosophical aspect of our thinking and frames it in very, very precise formal mathematical language. We shall not get into that, but it's one of the deepest discoveries of mathematical logic somewhere in the early 20th century. But it's basically something that brings up this self-referentiality. And so when we are asking about an explanation for something as fundamental as this notion of causation, as this notion of causality, as the notion of time which defines our day-to-day existence, then we cannot hope for an explanation merely in terms of words, either written or spoken. Yeah? This particular self-referentiality, this particular incompleteness, born in the structure of these of such an explanation is something that we really need to understand in order to even grasp the depth of this problem. So, right. So essentially, this this particular so when we are asking this question, how does this absolute become the finite? How does the something that is not graspable become something that is caught within the framework of our thought? What we are equivalently asking is how come something that we claim does not lie within the framework of time and causation, within the framework of space, time and causation, how does it come into this framework of space, time and causation? And any kind of an answer that is given necessarily has to be within the framework of space, time and causation. Hence, no answer is really possible. That is one way of looking at the problem. But that's not satisfying. It is an answer, and logically it's very consistent. But the very fact, well, it might satisfy some people, but this discussion is really for those who it does not satisfy. And the root of the problem really lies there. The root of the problem lies in the fact that we are not satisfied by such an answer. That means something that is logically consistent. It still does not satisfy our deeper urge for knowledge, for clarity, for understanding. And it is this deeper urge that makes us seek something more fundamental in this framework. This is what is called the quest for truth. In Sanskrit, this is what is called jigyasa. So that word jigyasa literally means, if you break it up, it's jna, that's the dhatu, plus sun is one. Sun is a certain pratyaya, which basically means repeating, plus a plus a, which means literally the desire for knowledge, rational framework. Desire for truth is what has given rise to this rational framework, this capacity to bear, to weigh pros and cons. It is this desire for truth that fuels inquiry, that gives you the energy behind the inquiry to desire to know, to go forward towards truth. Any serious scientific explorer, somebody, what's guiding that person in its purest form? It is precisely this desire for truth. I wouldn't say it's irrational, but it's irrational in the sense that you cannot capture it within the framework of reason, because reason is the instrument to get at truth. But the instrument itself is like, you could have a very sharp scalpel, but when will it cut? When there is somebody holding it with some strength, with some skill. This fuel, this energy that drives that machine called reason, is this desire. And that desire is not satisfied purely by this answer, that this particular question cannot possibly have an answer within the framework of reason. Because it's asking, what is the question really asking for? It's asking for this foundation of reason itself. It's asking, what does truth mean? How can I grasp truth as a purely personal, subjective experience? And this is really where the first person experience is supposed to somehow go beyond all possible third person experiences. What are we asking here? We are asking really, when we are asking what is existence, what is truth, what is knowledge, what we are really asking for is what is the universal dimension behind my subjective experience. You will see various traditions in Advaita Vedanta or in Madhyamika Buddhism which basically look at the start of studying this empirical I and then essentially come to the conclusion that this empirical I does not have an existence in and of itself. From the Advaitic point of view, it basically says that this I dissolves in some universal. And the Madhyamika Buddhism says basically that this individual I is a non-entity. Essentially, they are pointing a finger towards a certain subjective experience which is common to both. But the way forward is then not through this kind of third person reasoning. It is through reasoning. It is through analysis. But that analysis is not a third person analysis. In the sense it is not going to be comprehended by a sequence of logical statements that we can convey on paper or by speaking. What then? It has to be understood through a subjective analysis. When we are asking what is true, when we are asking what is this basic principle of existence that defines me in particular, which says that I exist, what is this principle of knowledge which says that I know, what is the universal dimension of that, the answer cannot be framed in terms of words. It is existence itself, its knowledge itself, which is there in me individually as a foundational principle. And what one is asking is, can I grasp it subjectively? So the point of inquiry, method of inquiry moves away from subjective experience that we can reproduce, moves away from objective experience that we can reproduce, to an analysis of the subject that experiences, an analysis of oneself. This is where the finger is being pointed. What is the method? First, asking oneself, well, what am I really aware? I mean, so there is this subject, there is this bunch of things that we want to unify. What are those things? My experience of a phone here, a mic here, a light there, etc., etc. But these are variegated experiences. What is the unifying principle behind all of this that says it is my experience? What is the practice? Are we aware of our experience at every point of time? Are we aware of the raw data that we are collecting? Sometimes our minds wander. Very common everyday experience. Which means, oh, I did not quite notice, we say that. There was some music, our minds were elsewhere, we did not really hear that. We read some words, those did not quite sink in. What then? Can we start cultivating this simple thing which is there with us all the time, this awareness which is the precondition for any subjective experience? This precondition, can we focus on it? Our minds are accustomed to focusing on the external phenomena, fragmented individual phenomena, instead of focusing on the subject that experiences these variegated phenomena. Which means that this consciousness, this subject which is there with us all the time, when we sleep, when we dream, when we wake up, when we eat, every little experience of ours that is there. But somehow it's something that we take for granted and do not focus on. Can we catch hold of that in and through every experience? That then is the way. Why? We tend to forget it at every point of time or very often. So the remedy to forgetfulness is lack of forgetfulness. Being aware of it. That simple solution is all that gives rise to this cultivation of alertness, cultivation of attention to whatever we are doing, cultivation of mindfulness as the Buddhists call it, cultivation of the presence of God as the Christians call it. But it is this one thing that is needed, this careful alertness, basically this is essentially what the best form of taking care of oneself is about. Being aware that at every time it is I who am experiencing this room around me. It is I who am experiencing the words that are being spoken to me or the words that I am speaking. This is the solution, the be-all, the end-all of all of this. Each of us has to do it according to his or her own lines. While different people have minds constituted differently, but each has some conscious experience. It's not something that is beyond us. It's not something sitting in some mystical twilight. It is the clearest thing of everything. We ourselves have decided to make these things obscure and then trying to catch hold of it in terms of some kind of a third-person framework. And that is exactly what is called wrong understanding in these philosophies. So what is the solution to wrong understanding? Right understanding. What is the practice? Maintaining awareness at every point of time. So we'll come back